bewegen, Welt verändern, als Salz und Licht.
Weltbeweger.
Gespräche über Gottes Wirken heute und Mission weltweit. Herzlich willkommen, liebe Missionsbegeisterten da draußen. Ich begrüße euch zu einer neuen Folge von Weltbeweger, dem Podcast der Allianz-Mission. Hier berichten wir über Gottes Wirken weltweit und Mission heute. Heute geht es nicht nur um Mission heute, sondern um Mission in Zukunft und das global. Und dafür habe ich eine tolle Gesprächspartnerin zugeschaltet aus den Vereinigten Staaten. Dr. Gina Zurlo ist heute mit hier im Gespräch und das Gespräch werde ich mit ihr auf Englisch führen. Dr. Zurlo, welcome to the podcast and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dr. Zurlo, you are Co-Director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, and recently you spent a lot of time researching the role of women in global Christianity. So much questions, one might ask, why is this focus so important today?
That's a great question. I think my motivations for doing the Women in World Christianity project were both professional and personal. So professionally, we have heard in academic research and studies for generations now, women make up the majority of church members around the world. And you would always have this statement, but then there would never be any hard data to back it up. So I kept running into these statements over and over, and they would say, yes, it's mostly women, but we don't know to what extent. So me thinking as a quantitative scholar, thinking there's got to be data somewhere, right? So that's kind of the professional side. But personally, you know, I am a woman of world Christianity, and I attend a lot of global Christian gatherings, lots of international conferences. And, pre-COVID, I had attended a series of such conferences. And over, I was one of just a handful of women in the room. And so I started to look around and think, I'm hearing that women make up the majority of churches around the world, but when I go to these gatherings, where are all the women? So it eventually just hit to a point where I said, enough is enough. Let's actually investigate this seriously and put some of these statements that people have been saying to the test and see, is it really true?
Okay. So you already mentioned 2 points I'd like to dig deeper in later. First is the big gap of data, of reliable data regarding gender in global Christianity. And the second point is the gap of possibilities of ministry and of theological education for women on a global scale. But before we dig deeper into that, in one of your recent talks, you opened with a course thesis that there would be no shift in Christianity to the global south as we know it without women. What are women, or how are women doing, believing, serving differently?
That's a great question. And I think all of the excellent research, demographically, historically, theologically, about the shift of Christianity to the global south has really helped illuminate our understanding of what world Christianity looks like today. It's a majority non-Western faith, lots of indigenous expression, fabulous research. But what you rarely hear about is the gender dynamic. It's as if the shift to the global south is some genderless thing of just some numbers or just some people somewhere doing something, kind of an amorphous thing. But these are actual people doing actual things in actual places around the world in their actual contexts.
Yes.
And if you think of who have been the most active participants in Christian churches throughout history and today, it's women. I don't care where I go in the world. I don't care what denomination I'm talking to, what kind of Christian organization. I ask them, think about your home congregation. Is it majority men or women? And they're like, oh yeah, it's definitely women. But this is kind of an afterthought. So I ask people to describe their congregations to me, and they can tell me how old it is, how many people, what kinds of ministries they have, what the church potluck is like after the service on Sunday. but they never say, my church is majority women. So women have been this afterthought, I think, of church history and of churches today. And I think a lot of women are just taken for granted that they're the ones preparing for the Sunday morning service, or taking care of the children, or making sure things are clean, or organizing things, or keeping the calendar, or, keeping the books, right? So women are these active participants, even though both men and women tend to both be members of churches. So that's what I'm identifying as the participation gap. Yeah, men and women are both members generally, but women are far outpacing men in participation. But because they're not at the main decision-making tables, and or they're not the people at the front of the sanctuary, their contributions are not considered as central as those of men. So these are all different kinds of gaps that I have identified in this project.
So talking personally regarding the history of the Allianz-Mission, 143 years ago, the first missionaries going to China were women. But remembering or telling all the stories, that is nothing that is in focus. For me personally, I have been a pastor, and now I'm working with Allianz-Mission, but in my church, I'm leading the children's service because I think it's so important that men are doing this work also. But I'm the only one. I'm the only man. That's a personal story. Coming back to the big gaps, you show up with why? Is it a question? So for some areas of the globe, it might be a cultural question, a question of communities or cultures where women are generally not equal, and that is something you quoted from the UN Human Development Report from 2019, where it said, "Nowhere in the world have women attained complete equality." That's shocking enough to see that from a Western world of view. But if current progress continues, it will take 202 years for women to be fully equal. Why?
When I saw that statistic in 2019, my jaw literally dropped, because you just think the world is progressing. Women are gaining more education. They have more opportunities. They have more employment that they can take part in. They're dying less in childbirth. Great. All these wonderful markers of progress. But then to see, the most global body tracking trends in gender equality say, actually, progress is slowing in closing the gap between men and women. And it's because the harder markers of equality are not being achieved. So great, fewer women are dying in childbirth, but women are not keeping pace with men in terms of higher levels of educational attainment, like PhDs and whatnot. They're not at the highest ranks of parliament, of governing, of politics, of business, of economics. And then we can apply this to the church too, right? Women are filling the pews, but they're not, quote unquote, climbing the ranks to be at the highest levels of decision-making bodies. So the same dynamic that we're seeing in all these different sectors of society, we're seeing in churches too. And I think there's three main barriers to women's access in this way. One you've mentioned is culture. And the culture question is hard because no one wants to make a statement about a particular aspect of culture that it's, quote, right or wrong or good or bad. That's a minefield. And so I don't want to get into that, but except for to say, if a woman feels called to do something, but cultural traditions are preventing her from doing it, that seems like a problem. And then the second is related to that, which is tradition. And Christianity has a long tradition of keeping men and women in different spheres, in different roles. So a lot of churches just kind of lean back on tradition and say, this is the way we've always done it. Women have never complained about not being able to do XYZ before. Why do we have to change? I think a lot of churches have a very glacial rate of change when it comes to some of these issues. And then the third, and of course, these are all interrelated, is scripture, is particular interpretations of Christian scripture that put men and women in different roles. And scripture can be interpreted every which way, up and down, to fit whatever particular theological tradition your church is a part of. And that has been used to keep women out of these higher levels of leadership and decision making. So between culture, tradition, and scripture, it's no wonder that women are having trouble filling this gender gap.
Okay, so let's ask, what are we missing? So talking in a kingdom mindset, saying that global Christianity is shifting to the global south, that we in the Western world, you in the US, me in Germany, we are no more the heart, we are no more the feet or the back of global mission, global Christian mission, but perhaps we are supporters, perhaps we are facilitators, something like that. What are we missing, not giving the majority of the world, Christian world population, a stronger voice in how to do church in a global and local scale?
I think a part of the problem is the decision-making table. Who's at the table? Who's making the tables? Who's setting the table? Who's cooking the food? What kinds of food? And who's at the table are all part of this problem. But I think if we don't have men and women together making these decisions, these gender gaps are going to persist. I'm not talking about some kind of reverse discrimination where we get rid of all of the men and women just run everything. There could be some benefits to that personally, but in theory, I'm not really saying that. I
won't comment that.
I really am saying equality of representation really does matter.
Yes.
And from one perspective, it's not hard to do. If you have a governing board of 6 people, it's not hard to put 3 men and 3 women on it. I guarantee you can find 3 women in your organization. Although if you really want to be representative of world Christianity, you really ought to have more women than men, but but that aside, if you don't have women's voices at the decision-making table, how can you take women's concerns seriously? I don't think we can assume that a group of men understand the uniqueness of women's experiences in the world and in the church.
History tells us different.
Yeah, absolutely. And so having women at the decision-making table is utterly critical because men need to hear them. Women need to feel safe to be able to tell what their experiences really are like. And there's a lot of trust building that has to happen because I think a lot of women don't feel safe to say, actually, when you said X or Y, that was really offensive to me, or I don't feel safe in this space because of how I've seen this person interact with this person, or all these kinds of dynamics that maybe women are a little more attuned to than men are. And so what happens in these decision-making bodies ripples throughout the organization, both locally and globally. So if you're a mission organization in the West and you're having trouble listening to the female voices in your own context, how on earth is anyone in your organization elsewhere in the world having a model to do the same somewhere else? Never mind the cultural and tradition of those local places that generally have even more strict rules about what men and women should do. So we have these compounding factors. So I think having models to really show what partnership and listening and hearing really looks like is such a critical starting point for this.
Do you experience, you said you're traveling a lot and when listening to your talks, and I suppose when your book regarding this topic will be released in, I think, October of this year, there will be a lot more to be read about it. Where globally do you experience positive examples of women being at the decision table?
That's a great question. I think what I'm seeing more often is women creating their own tables when they're excluded from the official tables. right? So why historically has mission been majority women, right? So Dana Robert estimated the 19th century American missionary movement, 2/3 female. Why? Well, because they were excluded from pastoral leadership opportunities in their home churches, but they were allowed to do all the same functions of a pastor overseas that they weren't allowed to do, which is both sexist and racist, frankly. So they made their own tables. They created their own boards. They were highly successful. They were great with money. They sent out pioneer missionaries and Bible translations. I mean, really incredible stuff. They created their own tables. And I see that happening today. So women who are Christian women engaging in peace building work around the world. Most global peacemaking organizations and bodies have very few women at the decision-making table, even though in times of conflict, it's women and children who are most acutely impacted because of militarization and all kinds of issues. Yet they're not at the official table. Well, what do? They create grassroots organizations. They create side conversations. They work through their local communities and networks to say, the men are talking about XYZ, but we know that ABC is really going to get something done here. So we're just going to go ahead and do it. So I see that more frequently, that women are just more likely to cross boundaries, whether it's a religious boundary, ethnic boundary, generational boundary, to do the work that needs to be done. And there's pros and cons to this, I think. It's great that women feel empowered to create these spaces for themselves. And I love that. And it is empowering, and they do get things done because of it. But they're still being excluded from the main decision-making bodies, from the top level, the international organization, whatever it is, that people perceive as being more powerful, more influential. So I think there's room. The world's a big place to have both these women-only spaces where women can get a lot done, and to have women's participation and influence and expertise and intelligence in these higher-level decision-making bodies.
Okay, so what I take out what you're explaining is two tasks for us in the minority world would be the first thing, to living in that parts of this world where equality is, and perhaps I'm very wrong, is nearer to being reached, that we take the opportunity to show our partners in the rest of the world how women can be at the decision-making table. And the other task for us would be to start listening. Start listening to those who, with grassroots movements, with creating their own tables, with creating home church networks in China, or believers meetings in the Arabic world, listening to those women and how they do church their way, right?
Yes, and fortunately, there are many examples that the West can be listening from for women. So the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, these are powerhouse women theologizing and serving as activists and thinking about the next generation, making explicit connections between gender rights, biblical studies, theological reflection, climate crisis, peace building, you name it. I mean, this is holistic Christian life and experience. And so we need Western Christians to be reading the theology from the Circle. From Pan Autumn of Pacific Islander, Asian American women. Like, they're creating spaces to theologize, to support one another. They're producing materials that really ought to be read by the rest of us. And I think in theological education in the West, there's not a lot of space for those voices still. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So the work of Pan Autumn, the work of the Circle, should be core to our theological reflection in the world today of what it means to be part of this global Christian community, not marginal or not absent, surely. This material should be core if we really want to be global Christians.
Talking of generations, you mentioned that. In your researches, do you notice generational differences in the attitude towards women's role in Christianity, particularly among younger believers, those we call Generation Z?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a greater push towards equality in the sense that it's just natural for them to want to see men and women working together, right? But I think there's a frustration generationally also, where every generation of women feels like they have to fight the same battles over and over again. So I'm a millennial, but my boomer parents had to fight for things that I feel like I'm still fighting for. And I have daughters who are teenagers, and I feel like, are they going to have to fight the same things that I'm fighting now? So there's this gender equality fatigue. I'm doing my best to fight the fights so that my daughters don't have to, but I have this sinking feeling that they're going to have to either fight a different set of battles, maybe, or maybe they're going to keep fighting the battles that I'm fighting now because, again, of this glacial rate of change. It might take more than 2 or 3 generations to get to the vision of what I hope this could be. And I don't know if I'm going to see it in my lifetime or my children's lifetime.
Glacial rate. I like that expression. Yeah. I wanted to ask you what shifts needed to be done to let your daughters experience gender equality within their lifetimes, but I guess you already answered that it might possibly be that they won't experience it in their lifetimes, and we already pointed some steps out towards equality. Something about you, hearing talks from you, reading about you, I was fascinated that on the one hand side, you're the co-editor of the World Christian Database. You are globally conducting research. You seem to love numbers, hard facts, as you said. But in your talks, you also invest to show what you call the human face of statistics. And I was asking myself if that is an inattention for you to see the single woman that is creating her own table in this global church, and also focusing on getting the hard facts to statistically show what we suppose, but don't have the facts for, or the data for. Is that attention for you?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I am keenly aware, perhaps more than anyone, of how dry statistics can be when you are this close to data all the time. And every day you're just scrolling through another several thousand line spreadsheet of something. You can start to think they're just numbers, right? But they're never just numbers, never. And that was a point that my predecessor, David Barrett, made when he pioneered all of this research and produced the first edition of the World Christian Encyclopedia. He put in the preface of this book that he purposely included photos of Christians in every country of the world to show the human face of statistics. There are 100 Christians in a country and you're one of them and you leave, now there's 99. That's the level of work that we're doing here. And I think keeping the human element of this really helps ground me as a researcher and just as a person to keep in mind, we're talking about real people, real lives, real contexts here. And the shift of Christianity to the global South, one of our major findings, has real implications. If it's just numbers, it's hard to tease out those implications. So I think keeping that human side to this kind of work is really utterly critical to communicate the data effectively and to enact change with it.
We were talking about the World Christian Database. So for those of our listeners or readers who don't know it yet, what is the World Christian Database? And for those who also love numbers, perhaps on an operational level, how is it possible to get numbers for global Christianity?
So the World Christian Database is an online tool where users can look up every country, every continent, every denomination, and get statistics past, present, and future on what the trends are. And there are 3 major sources of data in the World Christian Database. So the first is government censuses. So that's where we get information where a religion question is asked. We can get religion data from there, ethnicity data, language data. So most countries are asking information about all of their constituents every 5 or 10 years. The next is social scientific surveys and polls. So we track pretty closely with the social science world to see what kinds of questions are they asking about religious belief and practice that can help us kind of fill out our understanding of how religion is changing around the world. And for the Western world, there's a ton of research about secularization. What is the rate of secularization? What causes secularization? How do people switch from religion to non-religion? In what order? What do they drop first? So on and so forth. I mean, we have overanalyzed this in a way that's helpful. There's a lot of information out there. So we gather all of that. But then the third piece of information is data from religious communities themselves. And that's what sets us apart somewhat from other social scientists of religion, is that we think religious people actually know how to count. And so Christian churches and networks and denominations, I mean, I was just looking at some before we had our conversation. There are statistical reports and online databases and longitudinal analyses, and they're producing lots and lots of information, and you can see the trend lines through there. So we're gathering all of this kinds of information. We're triangulating it. We're weighing the sources to come up with our best estimates for affiliation to every religion and every country of the world, and then within Christianity down to the denominational level, so that we can tell you with some level of confidence how many Methodists are in every country, how many Pentecostals, how many Lutherans, so on and so forth. So that's really the core of who we are and what we do at the Center for the Study of Global Christianity.
Sounds like you have to read kind of whole library each day?
Pretty much.
Okay. So how big is the team?
So shockingly, our full-time team is only 3 people. It's myself, my co-director, Todd Johnson, and we have a database analyst, Peter Crossing, who lives in Australia. And then we have a team of part-time research assistants who are doing all that scraping for us. And then Dr. Johnson and I are doing the analytical level. But an important piece of this work is it's not just a group of people in Boston figuring out how many people affiliate to every religion in every country. We're constantly talking to our conversation partners around the world. I mean, hundreds of people. For the World Christian Encyclopedia, I emailed a Christian in every single country of the world. There's 237 countries, asking them, will you read this article? What do you think of these data? What are we missing? What should we be highlighting? So we really are trying to undertake global Christian research, not just tell everyone around the world what we think from our specific location.
Okay, so talking about a half an hour with you means that perhaps the numbers for 12 countries in the world will be less sharpened in the database, right?
I don't think so. I'll make up for it.
Okay. So, the BBC named you one of the 100 most inspiring and influential women in the year 2019. That is kind of an impressive thing to be done. I could ask you a lot about it, but what is more interesting is they called you that because I want to honor your work in quantifying religion worldwide. So you were noted on this list, but which women you got to know? Which of the faces of statistics would you love to see on this list?
That's a great question. When I wrote my book on women in world Christianity, in the acknowledgments section, I dedicated the book to all of the unnamed women in world Christianity who are overlooked, underpaid, underacknowledged, and yet working tirelessly for the sake of their Christian communities, their families, their societies to ensure a future for them. And really, those are the women of world Christianity that I keep in mind when I do my work, is all of the women we've never heard of. And this is a common theme. There's so many women in church history, we'll never know their names. They were just doing their work, living their lives, spreading the gospel, translating scripture, whatever it was. All of the indigenous Bible women will never know their names in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, who literally caused the shift of Christianity to the global south in their local communities. We'll never know their names. So those are the women. Those are the 100 most inspiring and influential women of world Christianity, is all the women we don't know.
Okay. So it's up to us to tell their stories where possible.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of space to start telling these women's stories. Let's identify these women. Let's celebrate them. Let's have them tell their stories. Let's do oral histories of people's mothers and grandmothers and aunts and cousins and sisters. Let's tell their stories. Let's get them into the Dictionary of African Christian Biography. Let's have African women tell the stories of their communities, and let's get them recorded in a way that in 50, 100 years, no one like me is saying this anymore. We could say, oh, we never used to know their names, but now we do. And look at all these incredible women that we can celebrate and can help kind of push us forward into the future. That's the goal. That's the vision. And there are people who want to do that. They're looking for the tools and the resources to do that work. But I see more and more of that, which is really encouraging.
I think that is something I love most, being fortunate in being allowed to telling the hope stories of people experiencing God, experiencing Him working through them in their communities globally, and to make that accessible, understandable, and also a big hope for those reading it. We recently had a small book regarding to use with 100 stories of hope, because I think that is what mission is about. It's about the single stories. And I got the impression that perhaps the next book you're writing might be something like the 100 most inspiring and influential women of 2030, perhaps. I don't know when you're finished with your book. You are all ready to start a second round, because one thing I already mentioned at the beginning is you digged so deep into all the numbers available, and you experienced this big data gap. And you in your talk you quote studies from Benin, from Mozambique, from Korea or China, which justify the assumption that 2/3 or 3/4 of Christians in the world are active female members. What will be the second round in the Woman in World Christianity project about? What are your expectations and hopes for it?
My goal in the second round is to further nuance this gap between membership and participation, because the results from the first round of the project are correct, but they're not very interesting, I will say. So, for example, and I feel okay saying that. So my study found that African Christianity is 52% female by membership. Now, if you tell anyone who knows anything about African Christianity that the churches are 52% female, they will laugh at you. And I know this because they have laughed at me, and that's fine. But the reason why that exists is because of a lack of on-the-ground data to really get at this nuance of, yeah, maybe men and women are both members, but without women, this whole thing would utterly collapse. So the data set I produced doesn't communicate that reality the way that I want it communicated. So that's why I want to do this next round, to really get at that nitty-gritty level, to show they're not just quote unquote 52%. One, there's probably more data out there that I can find to get at these higher numbers. But two, it's the participation piece. How can we show that women are showing up more, that they self-identify as religious more, that they pray more, that their whole lives, in a sense, revolve around this religious community in a way that's just not true for men? So this is the reality that I really want to tease out in the next part of the project, so that we can say, using the highest levels of social scientific data and methods, I did the thing, I replicated the Pew Research Center study, global Christianity is 52% female, great. But from this other perspective, this is where you really see world Christianity as a women's movement. So I want to be able to have both sides of the data to really illuminate the global situation better.
Okay, so get global data, 3 persons. For how long are you thinking about this second round?
Well, right now it's only a year, so I don't have a lot of time. But between the end of the first round and beginning the second round, I'm getting tons of stuff coming across my every single day. No matter what I'm looking at, people are now sending me things because they're hearing me talk about this project more. They're telling me more stories. I'm seeing more studies. So I've been collecting a lot of information over the last few years that will feed into the second part of this. But I do have some pretty lofty goals for the next year. So a year from now, hopefully I will have some more interesting findings on world Christianity as a women's movement.
Well, I guess the findings represented us today were already pretty impressive and very interesting. Thank you very much. Directing toward the end of our conversation, your heart is showing the personal face of statistics, telling stories of hope. For you personally, where and how do you experience God working with this vast and complex statistics?
When I see people living out what they feel called to do, that's where I see God. I see God in reason and personal experience, in people flourishing and being fulfilled and saying, hey, I saw this issue and I came with a solution and I want to solve it. Or I feel like I really have the gifts of leadership and, want to serve in this way. And when I see people living out and acting in ways that they are just so clearly created to be and to do and to serve, I mean, what is more beautiful than that when you see people flourishing for the sake of others, right? And that's what we see in global Christianity, is this constant reaching out towards others and trying to improve society and trying to strengthen families and communities. And that's one of the things that keeps me going in this work, despite the data gaps and the discouraging data and how difficult it can be. It's the people who are pushing through all of that noise to do the thing they know they've been gifted to do. That's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. There would be so much more to be told or asked for all our listeners and readers. I'll put the link to your talks on YouTube in the show notes, as well as a link to your book that will be released in October. So who wants to dig deeper into this topic has the ability to do so. We always finish our podcast with the hardest task. This is to finish with one sentence. Which one sentence would you like to share with our readers and listeners, both female and male?
One sentence? That is very difficult.
Ah, it's already passed. No, okay.
My one sentence is that context matters.
Danke für Ihr Interesse und dass Sie so Teil von Gottes weltweiter Mission sind.